Thursday, 31st of August. As you can see behind me, the sky's cleared. The hurricane's up in the Carolinas now, and it is causing trouble up there, but we've been very lucky, we've escaped it. And up till now you've seen me visiting Disney parks, which are great fun and bring out the child in everyone, but today I'm somewhere a little bit different that also brings out your inner child. Yeah, we're back at Kennedy Space Center in the Rocket Garden. And Mickey Mouse, yeah, everybody likes Mickey Mouse, but every little boy wanted to be an astronaut as well, didn't they? So we're going to have a little look around, starting with the Rocket Garden here. And then we've got the Atlantis Space Shuttle, we've got the Saturn V, and lots of other things, but we'll start the tour here in the Rocket Garden. Let's go have a look. First on the tour, we've got this enormous silver monster here. Is a Redstone rocket, which is not actually a purpose-built space rocket. It's actually designed for carrying nuclear warheads, and what you did, because it was the space race and the Americans were always behind the Soviets, they didn't have time to build purpose-built rockets. Take the nuclear warhead off and replace it with that thing there, which is this absolutely tiny thing here. Look at that person just walking past. This is not much taller than me. And of course it's the Mercury capsule. That's what Alan Shepard and John Glenn went up in. Dear God, can I even get in here? Oh Lord, I'm not even going to try and get in there. I'm 6'4" and I am not going to try and get in this tiny little thing. But that's what they went in. Just a few months after Major Yuri Gagarin. And that's absolutely tiny. Look at those lovely yellow butterflies. Aren't they nice, eh? Next one we've got, it's actually earlier than Redstone. This is Juno, and right at the top of there, that was the very first satellite that the US put into space, just a few months after Sputnik. So it's smaller than the Redstone, which is back there, which is what Shepard used for the first US man in space. So it's a little bit of an earlier rocket. And then we got this one, which is the Agena, I believe. Oh, was that Telstar? Yeah, this is the rocket that launched Telstar, though. The first TV satellite. And that's another Redstone there. Off in the distance, we'll go and see it later, but there's the two booster rockets and the main fuel tank for the space shuttle missions. And you can see there's another capsule. That's probably the Gemini capsule, which is a bit bigger. You'd have two astronauts in there. Let's go have a look at that. That's Gemini capsule. And over there, that looks like the Apollo, which had three. Continue on. Okay, so there's the Juno at the back, which was one of the earliest ones. Then you've got the Redstones that carried the very earliest capsules at the top there, and put Alan Shepard into space, and John Glenn. And then we moved on to bigger and more powerful rockets. That is a Titan II, which again was not purpose built for the space race, but the Americans were in such a hurry to keep up with the Soviets that again, this was an ICBM. You take the nuclear warhead off the top and you put this thing on instead. And this capsule is a bit bigger. This is Gemini. In the twins, of course, and look, two people. Two astronauts would sit here. Yeah, this is a bit roomier, that's better. I can sit in this comfortably. There'd be another astronaut next to me. And the Americans did their first spacewalk out of one of these, which wasn't the safest thing. The other astronaut who wasn't going out would suit up. They'd open the hatch, and I'd jump out. And that's how the first spacewalk was done. Up to now, we've just seen the Gemini and the Mercury project, which were basically strapped onto rockets that weren't designed and purpose-built to take people up into space. They were ICBMs. You take the warhead off, put a capsule on. But with the next stage of the space exploration program, you needed something a bit bigger. Because to go to the moon, you need more than 2 people, you need 3. And there is a scale of the Apollo capsule. Can I get in here? Yeah, I could get in here comfortably. However, this is all they had to go all the way to the moon, which is... I can fit in there comfortably, but a few days in there, probably not very comfortable. That's the Gateway building, which is space exploration present and future. I'm going to have a look at it in a bit. But going back to this, so there's the Apollo capsule. Not the biggest thing in the world, of course, but to get it into orbit, you need something a bit bigger than these ICBMs. You need something like, say, this. And it will be at the very front of this rocket here. Ah ha ha, I hear you say yes, this would put Apollo people into space. Because this is the Saturn V, you say. Wrong. This is not Saturn V, this is Saturn 1. And yes, it put early Apollo missions up into low Earth orbit, but it didn't have the capability to put something big enough to go to the moon up into orbit. 225 feet long. So tall that, being honest, as you've seen from my videos, you get hurricanes around these parts. So tall you don't want to stand it up, because it would dwarf all these ICBMs. It is the biggest thing in the rocket garden, but it's just the early stages of the Saturn project, the Apollo project, sorry. Saturn 1. You can just see there's the engines at the back, the business end. Yeah, they're big engines. But to give you an idea, there's one engine, one F1 engine from a Saturn V rocket. There was 5 of these on the business end of a Saturn V. And they're about twice the size of the actual Apollo capsule. So the men that went to the moon had to live in something smaller than the engine, one of the engines that put them up into orbit. And we'll just finish off the rocket garden. This tall monster here is Delta. And whenever you're trying to find somewhere and you need directions, or you're using your car sat-nav, you can thank Delta, because they put the GPS satellites up into orbit. And they're still being used at the minute to put various satellites into space. That's the only thing in the rocket garden still being used. Everything else, long retired. And look at that, I can't even get it in one shot, this thing. So we move on, that's the rocket garden. We'll go and have a look at the Gateway now. And then in the background you can see there's the Space Shuttle fuel tank and boosters. We'll go have a look at the Space Shuttle Atlantis, and then we'll go and try and find Saturn V rocket, which put this into orbit for the successful moon missions. Up until now, we've just been looking at historic methods of space exploration. We've seen Gemini, we've seen Mercury, Apollo, and of course the Space Shuttle. But they're all retired now, so I'm in a hallway now which is detailing space exploration, present and future. So there's lots of different things in here. We'll start with the present. There's a SpaceX Dragon capsule which takes astronauts to the International Space Station. We've got the Starliner there, which is an experimental Boeing 7-person module, and another Boeing experimental Habitat for deep space exploration. At the back there you can see some Delta rocket models, Delta 5, Vulcan and Delta 4. They put a lot of satellites into space. And this is the Orion space capsule. And that there is an actual Orion that's been up into low Earth orbit and returned successfully. And the Orion is what NASA hope to put crews for the moon missions into. The moon missions, of course, will be launched from the top of one of these. Now, of course, this is just a model, but that is the Space Launch System, which will launch the Artemis program, and that's what they'll travel in. That's the head, that's the top of it, the capsule. Well, whoa, let's zoom out. Other concept there, it's written upside down, that says DC 101, Dreamcatcher 101. That's a potential replacement to the space shuttle. It carries as many astronauts as the old shuttles, but it's only a quarter of the size. So it's a lot more efficient. You need a lot less power to get it up into orbit. And the thing that dominates this room is this monster at the back, which fills the hall. It's huge, and as you can see, it looks a bit battered, for want of a better phrase, because it's been up into orbit and come back twice. And that, of course, is a SpaceX Falcon 9, which was groundbreaking. I remember watching this 2016, 2017, I think. It was absolutely groundbreaking watching this come back with its two boosters. The two boosters landed back at Cape Kennedy, and this landed on a drone ship out in the Atlantic, and this was just a phenomenal achievement to bring something this big back. And then it went up again about a year later, and it put Elon Musk's Tesla Roadster up into orbit. This is the very rocket that did it. So this is the present, and over there, that's the future. You might be watching this video in a few years' time and say, oh yes, that, I recognise that, that's what put men back on the moon. And women, of course. That's the plan, to certainly put people back on the moon, and it may very well be done using that rocket and that capsule there. Come inside while it's raining into something called Heroes and Legends. So you've got the man in gold is Alan Shepard, the first American in space, just after Yuri Gagarin. And then you've got some very familiar names. You've got, there's John Glenn and Gordon Cooper, and of course Alan Shepard again. There's Jim Lovell, Buzz Aldrin, Neil Armstrong, Frank Borman. So yeah, this is, and look how far this goes around, all these people, all the men and women who've been into space. Certainly from the NASA perspective, it doesn't include the Soviet Union or companies such as SpaceX or Blue Origin, but yeah, this is quite nice just while the rain is pouring down outside, but just having a little look around in here. Just to give an idea of scale, Jupiter, Redstone, Juno, Mercury, Redstone, Mercury, Atlas, Gemini, Titan, and the Saturn 1, and the Saturn 1B that we saw, and then there, Saturn 5. It's just an absolute monster next to everything else. Had a bit of a downpour here, but blue sky now, it's drying out again. And the next thing on the itinerary, Space Shuttle Atlantis, which you can't get in. It's huge. Look at that. That's the solid rocket boosters and the big orange fuel tank that held all the fuel to put the shuttle into space. It's enormous. That's possibly bigger than the Saturn 1. So let's go inside and have a look. Now, the only trouble with the Apollo missions was you had an enormous amount of stuff went into space, and 95% of it was disposable. So the next challenge for NASA was to create something that could come back. And here it is. Reusable multiple times. And yes, it's retired now, but here we have Space Shuttle Atlantis. There's a docking arm that would reach out. I can almost touch this docking arm, it comes out so far. And the wing goes below this walkway here. That's not the end of the wing. And there's the docking arm. I can almost reach there. Oops. And the payload would be in the middle here, of course, the crew at the front. And the engines at the back. But these weren't the main engines that brought it up into space. It's those huge rocket boosters we saw outside and the fuel tank that are also outside, they were considered disposable, but the rest of it was reusable, and it was a big step forward for space exploration. We finally have something where most of it comes back and can be used again. And it's some size, I have to say. It's not on the scale of the Saturn rockets, but this is enormous. So another view of Atlantis. I'm just standing over the port wing, which continues under this walkway there, right down there. Just looking at the size of these engines back here, I'm only 6 feet away from them. So I can say with confidence that this is how much space exploration developed in the 25-30 years between the first men in space and the space shuttle. These engines are bigger than Gemini and Mercury, and they're not a million miles off the size of the command module of Apollo. And the underside here is, of course, all the thousands of ceramic tiles that were the heat shield for the shuttle. And over here is a model of the International Space Station. Now, I'm not going to go on there, that's more for a kid to play on, and I don't want to get stuck, but that's what this would dock with. Of course, it's retired now, so it's the Dragon modules launched on the Falcon 9s that we saw in the Gateway complex. But it was a workhorse, was Atlantis. It did a lot of launches of satellites, repairs to the Hubble telescope and the like. There's the vehicle assembly building. One of the biggest buildings in the world.
Right back in that building.
The blue section of the American flag on this building is the size of a five-a-side court. That's how big it is. Each star on the American flag is 6 feet across. That's how big it is. And that's where all the Apollo program rockets were built. And all of the Challenger, all of the space shuttles were prepared here. And in the future, it's where the SLS will be assembled for the Artemis missions to the Moon and Mars.
Towers over there. The shorter tower is actually launch pad A.
Okay, we're at the Apollo Center, just waiting to go in. I'm just standing in the Apollo Garden, which commemorates all the Apollo missions. And there, of course, you've got Collins, Aldrin and Armstrong. If you look there, there's some seats and viewing for a viewing area, because if you look just through there, I don't know if I'll be able to hold this steady enough, but look, there is a Falcon 9 rocket on the pad, and if weather permits, it's going up in a few hours. If weather permits, though, I have to stress, we have had a hurricane, we've had a few things cancelled because of the weather. There was a launch meant to go Tuesday, that was cancelled, and it's been put back a full month. So we'll just have to wait and see, but that's probably the closest I'll ever get to an actual rocket. But now I'm going to go in, head in and go and see the Apollo program museum. Alright, that was the Apollo Garden I was just showing you. And right off in the distance, that's about 5 miles away now, but look how big it is, the vehicle assembly building. Still looms on the horizon. And now I'm inside, and I'm in the presence of something that I have seen grown men cry at. Not in despair, of course. Tears of joy. First of all, there's the command and service module. Now, you saw a nose cone of the Apollo project in the rocket garden area, which is just this bit here. That's the nose cone. That is all the astronauts had. The rest of this service module is propulsion at the engine end, the business end. Little adjustments can be made with these thrusters here, and all of this contains fuel, water, fuel cells for generating electricity, electronics, computer systems, navigational systems. But that front end is all the astronauts had, and to get this into space, as we've seen from the rocket garden, you need something a little bit bigger than a Redstone or a Titan or an Atlas rocket. You need something like that. There's the 5 assembled engines, which is just the size of this thing, it's incredible. Each of those engines is bigger than the module the astronauts had. So 5 Apollo nose cones would fit comfortably in those 5 engines, comfortably in. And this is just the first stage of the Saturn V rocket, which we're going to explore in a bit more detail now, but I'm just going to have a quick look at the nose cone. And there it is. That's all they had in there. Obviously that will be filled with navigational equipment, computer systems, seating, and this little hatchway here, this would dock with the lunar lander called the LEM, the landing module. But that is all the astronauts had in there. That tiny piece of the front end of the command and service module, which in itself was the tiny front end of this this unbelievably big rocket. So let's go and explore it. Before we go into detail with the rocket, there's all the patches and badges from the missions. Apollo 1, which was the fire, of course, which tragically killed White, Grissom and Chaffee. And we've got Apollo 7, which launched a command module that went around the Earth. Then, of course, the big step forward, Apollo 8, that took Borman, Lovell and Anders to the moon and back. Then we had Apollo 9, which was a practice of docking the command module that we've seen with the lunar lander in Earth orbit. Then came Apollo 10, which was a full dress rehearsal, as it was called, for the moon landing. So Stafford, Young and Cernan went to the moon, and 2 of them actually descended to within a few miles of the surface and then turned back and came back to Earth. And you have to admire the discipline and determination of those men. They were a few miles from glory, and they turned around to make way for the most famous badge, Apollo 11, which needs no further commentary. And then Apollo 12, continuing on, Apollo 13, which of course is famous for other reasons, Apollos 14, 15, 16 and 17 right at the back. And that of course is something worth noting. I'm only looking at this unbelievably big rocket because this was deemed to be too expensive. Some bean counters for the American government decided Apollo was too expensive. So this would have been used to put Apollo 18 or 19 into orbit. But because it was deemed too expensive, it was preserved here. And that is the first stage, which I've just been walking along. That would get you a few miles up, well on the way to low Earth orbit, but these absolutely enormous stage would have held unbelievably large amounts of liquid fuel and oxygen, but it burned out after only a few minutes, and this would drop into the Atlantic Ocean, and then stage 2 would kick in, which is here. And these engines are smaller. These are called J3 engines, still 5 of them, but they're a bit smaller. And stage 2 would get you into low Earth orbit and would actually take you on a single orbit of the Earth. But again, even though it's absolutely enormous, this is the second stage, and this is bigger than the Mercury or the Redstone rockets or any of the ICBMs we saw in the rocket garden. This would provide enough fuel and propellant to get you around one Earth orbit, and then that too would be ditched somewhere in low Earth orbit. So they're still probably floating around somewhere up in up in space, up above the Earth, and then stage 3 kicks in. Just a single engine now because we're up into space itself, and this would get you on the way to the moon. And once this had done its burn, the command module was well on the way to the moon. This would then be ditched in space as well, and all that would be left on the way to the moon is the 4th section. You can see the hollow out there, that's where the lunar module would be, the LEM. And right in front of it, the command and service module, which is encased in this protective covering, so you can't actually see the business end of the command and service module, but there you can see the actual module. And that at the very front is that mini rocket is a safety feature. If there was any problem with the larger emphasis on larger, any problem with the larger rocket, this mini rocket would fire and would propel the module where the 3 men were. It would propel them to safety while the rocket did whatever it did, blowing up or undergoing some catastrophic failure. So there it is. You have to excuse, there's a tour going on at the same time. And there is the lunar module. That's the lunar module there, which was carried all the way there by the command and service module. And there again is another module. Can we have a look in there? We can. Hey, look at that. That's all they had. That's all the room they had. So that gives you a better idea of how little room they had on their journey. And continuing round, there's the LEM. And there's Armstrong and Aldrin made it onto the moon, thanks to the absolutely enormous rocket we see in this hangar. And look what we found here. Here's an actual piece of moon rock. Basalt, it's called. Basalt mare, it's called. So there I am touching a piece of the moon that came back from the Apollo programs. And this is the second time I've seen this, and I'm still in awe. I'm absolutely overwhelmed by the size of this thing, and as I said at the start of the video, I've seen grown men cry seeing this. The scale of the engineering. A few little bits we've got here. There's a moon rover from Apollo 16, which is a lot bigger than the Apollo 14 moon rover, which was just a pull-along cart. So there's poor old Alan Shepard, the first American in space, training with one to use on the moon. And that's Apollo 17's, which is bigger still. Well, these aren't obviously the ones from the Apollo missions that went to the moon. These are ones that would have been used for training and also would have been used maybe for future Apollo missions that were cancelled. There's an actual spacesuit used by Gene Cernan in training for Apollo 17. And this thing, this is the second time I've seen this monster rocket, and it never ceases to amaze. The sheer size of this, the technology. Yes, the technology's 60 years old almost, but 400,000 people were involved in building this and getting it into orbit and putting people on the moon. It's just absolutely incredible. It's absolutely brilliant. And just as a side note, as I said earlier, Apollo and the shuttle program and Gemini and such like, they're all in the past. But this is still an active spaceport. That's SpaceX. There is a Falcon 9 on the pad there. Over there, that's one of NASA's pads. And there's another launch pad right over there. I don't know if the weather's going to hold. But if the weather does hold, that Falcon 9 rocket is going up in a few hours. But I don't know with all the hurricane conditions we've had recently. But a reminder that Apollo is finished and all the other things we've seen so far today. But here are reminders of the present and what is to come. This is a fun little detail. This is simulating the famous walk along the gantry into the capsule. So I've just walked along the gantry 34 stories up, and that's where they climbed in, and that gives you a much better idea than an empty module down at the rocket garden. That's all they had for 6, 7, 8 days to the moon and back. That's all they had, plus of course the landing module, the LEM. But for the first few hours until they docked with the LEM, that was all the 3 men had. Well, that concludes Kennedy Space Centre. Just show you while I'm here, just over there. See the blue building? Blue Origin. That's where Jeff Bezos builds his rockets. Now, talking of rockets, there is a launch scheduled 2 hours and 55 minutes for SpaceX Falcon 9, but being honest, I think that's going to happen. I've just looked at a report. There's a 20% chance of favourable weather, and we are still on the back end of this hurricane. So if I was young, free and single, I might hang around, but I'm going to call it a day. And I'll keep an eye on it online, and even from 50 miles away we'll still see it if it launches. So yeah, that's the end of Kennedy Space Centre.